you are right. It's completely unsustainable. And that is also the case with Bosnia and Herzegovina, with Republic of Srpska. So we certainly are looking at the situation intensifying. But you've also said at some point, and this has been ringing true in a lot of Serbs' minds ever since the 1990s, that we have allowed essentially an Islamic radical mafia to control most of the region. The fear that people have today of immigration, essentially, and this is not an unfounded fear, because we are now unvetted migrants or immigrants from Afghanistan are being placed in Kosovo, in North Macedonia, in Albania. We're also bringing them here. Do we know that these people are vetted? Do they understand also the remnants of the Mujahideen forces from the 1990s and the terror cells that have remained there, that have been involved in every single terrorist attack in Europe, including 9/11 here? There's always been a connection to the Balkans. We opened the Pandoras Box.
Yes, absolutely. And again, Europeans at the time, particularly the British and the French and the Germans, all three, were very sensitive to this reality. We identified Osama bin Laden and many of his deputies or captains, if you will, along with roughly 50 to 60 so-called Mujahideen fighters on the ground in Albania. We knew that.
Yes.
Unambiguous. And we had already seen this operation that moved between Albania and up into Herzegovina in the area called the Sanjak.
Mm-hmm.
We had seen the movement of these entities back and forth. We understood what it was about, and Izetbegovic, who was the man that became the initial leader of the Bosniaks, was absolutely a self-identified Turkish Muslim.
Absolutely, he was imprisoned for this.
Yes, and his aims were abundantly clear, but there was this bizarre notion in Washington D.C. In the elites here that we were going to show the Muslim world that we were prepared to fight for the interests of Muslims. Why anyone thinks that the people that are living in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Pakistan are particularly interested in what happens in the Balkans is beyond me, because they're not. But nevertheless, we took that position, and we tended to turn a blind eye to the very matter that you're describing. So we've created a disaster on the ground in the Balkans. Rebuilding, recreating an Islamic state on European soil after Europeans collectively spent hundreds of years driving the Muslim Turks out of Europe is beyond rational. It's insane. But we've done it. And again, this is a monument to the notion that somehow or another we Americans, with our European friends, can create new things where they have failed previously and make them work. It doesn't. It won't.
Can we go back? Because now, I don't know when was the last time you've been to Europe. We look at France, we look at Great Britain, we look at Germany. They have been completely transformed. And there is certainly a point of no return. And many of us are fearing that we here in the United States are reaching a point of no return. As you said, our border is a disaster. And people are coming in completely unvetted, clearly untested and unvaccinated as well. Europe is almost lost, many feel. How do we fight this back? Is it too late?
Well, I hesitate to say it's too late, and the reason for that is that the unimaginable is still possible. And the unimaginable means that new governments come to power, and those governments are nationalist, and those governments recognize that the survival of their respective nations and civilization is at stake, and they will force many of these people out of the country. Lots of Americans think that's impossible. I don't think it is. I don't think it's impossible inside the United States. I'm not necessarily saying it will or will not happen. I'm just pointing to that as a very real possibility. possibility.
Sure.
Again, everything can endure as long as there is an inexhaustible quantity of cash to support it. That's very important to understand. If
Follow the money.
Yes, if the Germans can continue to provide billions and billions of euros to sustain these Muslim populations on German soil almost indefinitely, then I guess things will be fine. But I don't see that happening. I don't think it's going to happen in France. I think we are all headed into new territory when it comes to the economy. I think we're headed for a financial crisis that is significant. It's not going to be mastered by simply printing more cash. In fact, the opposite is the case. I think we will be compelled to disengage largely from our overseas commitments as an economic measure. And I think the American people are going to demand action inside the United States to remove large numbers of people who are clearly criminals, terrorists, and in Europe, I think a similar situation will occur. I just don't know when, and I don't know how, but that's the way things tend to go. I mean, you tend to be very dependent upon economic stability. When that economic stability is gone, then so is everything that depends upon it.
Sure. Something that has been put out, and President Trump has been very vocal on it, something that we call the swamp, the deep state. I call it permanent unelected bureaucracy, and clearly everything you've said today rings true, particularly for those unelected bureaucrats in the European Union. Same here. We're looking towards 2022 and potentially 2024. The election integrity is a big thing. However, one thing that nobody seems to answer also is we may have an election where, as we've seen last time around, we elected President Trump. President Trump may appoint some people at the top. We may vote for senators, congressmen and women. But that permanent unelected bureaucracy, when we talk about the State Department, when we talk about our agencies that have been infiltrated, how do we get rid of that type of swamp? Because that seems to remain. See, people who we elect, in their eyes, they are a temporary nuisance. They'll come and go, but they remain. How do we change this? Because before we fix even 2020, looking ahead of the election that's coming, there is that unelected bureaucracy that will stay with us. What do we do about that?
The left has reached two erroneous conclusions. The first erroneous conclusion is elections are not referendums. Most of what's been going on in this country, everything from unrestricted immigration, open borders, to declaring marriage to be effectively anything you want to call it, are things that were never determined by referendum. Whereas the American people were never asked, do you support X, yes or no? Do you want X, yes or no? They were never asked. They were never asked, do you want to intervene in the Middle East? Do you want to intervene in the Balkans? Do you want to do? We've never had any referendums like that. And quite frankly, if you had referendums, I think the answers would have come back almost inevitably as no. We don't support it. We don't want it. So the first thing is elections aren't referendums, but the left thinks that because they've managed to win a majority of elected seats, that they have absolute authority and power to do as they wish. The second thing is what you're talking about. Unelected bureaucrats cannot and must not and do not govern. But they're governing. That's the problem. The unelected bureaucrats are governing. And the elections are not referendums, but they're being treated as such. So the left thinks that it's working its way into a position of permanent government. Now, there are only a couple of ways to change that. One is you have a crisis involving the economy and finance, which I think is coming. and the government implodes because it demonstrates that it is not confident, that it cannot manage the crisis. I think there's a very real potential for that in the near future.
Okay.
The second is that eventually there are rebellions, not necessarily armed rebellions, but rebellions in the sense that people simply stand up and say, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to tolerate it. It's unacceptable to us. That's then if they are treated badly, if they are harmed in any way, physically harmed, then you get an open revolt. But I think the most likely scenario is the first one, that the government demonstrates it's not competent. I mean, that's what we saw in Afghanistan. We saw the government is not competent. The senior officers in the military are not competent. They don't know what they're doing. And I think we're going to see more evidence of that here. We've seen lots of evidence for that along the border. It's not just a blatant criminal act in the sense that we fail to enforce our own laws. It's blatant incompetence. We don't have the resources or the manpower to deal with the border. And now suddenly, as it becomes clear that we cannot afford any more people coming into the country and flooding the emergency rooms and hospitals, flooding low-income housing everywhere, suddenly the administration says, well, maybe we will have to use some military power on the border. But you know as well as I do that if they employ forces on the border, those forces will be constrained and unable to do anything that makes any sense. So a lot of things have to happen. And tragically, we know from human history that before things can get better, they frequently have to get much worse. I think they're going to get much worse. I think it's patently obvious.